Please give Eric a warm welcome.
I'm going to talk about the current status of renewable energy around the world in terms of markets and investments, and then I'm going to focus on cities, what cities around the world are doing. It's an amazing picture, actually. I used to say that hundreds of cities are doing activities, enacting policies, providing finance, a whole range of things that cities are doing to promote renewable energy over the last several years in particular. I used to say hundreds of cities, and now I say thousands of cities, because it literally is thousands of cities around the world that are enacting targets and plans for both climate, for energy efficiency, for renewable energy. So I'll give you some examples. It may be actually an overwhelming series of examples, but I think you'll get the idea. And a lot of this certainly can apply to New Zealand, and I've been focused on that these last years. Actually, I first came to New Zealand in 2003 to tramp the Te Araroa a hiking track from Cape Reinga to the Bluff, and I did that. It took me about 5 months. That's when I met Rafe. I fell in love with the country. Such kindness was extended to me during my trek that I felt I had to come back. And I've been coming back every year since 2008, hopefully to contribute in some ways to New Zealand's sustainable energy future through courses and through lectures and through other activities that I'll continue to do. So with that, let me just, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to work here in New Zealand in the farther future, the far future even, to see these things happen here, beyond where they are already. So, as Rafe mentioned, I was the lead author of the Renewables Global Status Report by REN21. I created this report actually in 2005 when I was living in China, and wrote it as the lead author for the first 6 years. It's now a global reference of 200 pages that 500 people contribute to every year. So it covers markets, investments, policies, industry, rural development, and it's a great reference. I urge you to read it. It's a free download. So just some highlights from the version which just was published last month. In terms of investment, $250 billion with a B invested in renewable energy last year, and that's been roughly the same. I say 250, about 270, 230, but 250 roughly for the last 5 years invested in renewable energy. And that's more than the world invested in all other forms of power generation put together. So renewable energy is now the major source of investment, the major destination for investment in the power sector globally. Last year, more than 70% of all power capacity added globally was renewable energy, and only 30% of conventional gas, coal, nuclear. So renewable energy is now the dominant form of investment. And you can see that that's evened up in developed countries. They're about equal now. These two bars represent developed and developing countries, and developing countries have been growing. A lot of that is China. And so, this picture is surprising to many people in terms of how much is being invested. If you look at that divided by technology, you can see that the majority of investment now is going into wind and solar. And this may surprise you also, that $150 billion, again with a B, invested in solar power last year alone. $150 billion, that's $20 for every person on the planet invested in solar power just last year alone. 40 gigawatts added, about 7 million rooftops added with solar just last year. That's 7 times probably the total number of rooftops in New Zealand. And then wind has been a strong form of investment all along. You can see here also biomass and biofuels and small hydro, geothermal, etc. And when we started doing this 10 years ago, these were all fairly comparable in terms of investment. But in the last 10 years, these have stayed about the same, while wind and solar have really grown tremendously. Where that investment is taking place, a lot of data here. You can get my slides later, but this is the U.S., been fairly constant, a little bit up and down. Here's the rest of the Americas. Here's Brazil, Africa, India. What I really wanted to highlight actually was China, which has been growing tremendously over the last 10 years. due to a number of policies, due to a real focus. China is now the investment leader in renewable energy. It's the global leader in investment and just about everything else. $80 billion invested in renewable energy last year in China alone, and most of that was for wind and for solar. Europe, we don't have time to go into why Europe has seen such declines in recent years, but it's still relatively strong compared to these other regions. If we're thinking about local renewables, then the question of jobs comes up. Again, a lot of information here, but the bottom line is 7.5 million jobs in renewable energy industries globally, and about half of that is actually in China, 3.3 million jobs, almost half. And a lot of it is now in the solar industries, solar power industries. A lot of it continues to be in wind and also biofuels. So this is the kind of information that you can get from the report, and you can read about it in detail. Just to go through very quickly in terms of the various technologies, wind power has been growing by 20, 25, 30% for the last 10 years annually, up to 370 gigawatts. That's been a fairly consistent increase over these last 5 or 6 years, led by China, led by the US, and other countries. You can see here the additions last year in China outweighed or dwarfed just about anybody else. 23 gigawatts of wind power added in China last year. The US was second with 5. Germany also had 5 added. And China has really taken the lead in wind over the last 10 years. Again, due to policies. You know, when I first got there in 2005, they had almost no wind market. This was virtually zero, 2005. And they enacted a national law on renewable energy in 2005 with a feed-in tariff for wind power, and that really began the growth of the market. And nobody expected this to happen. You know, the World Bank back in 2000 projected that China would have about 20 gigawatts perhaps by the year 2020. And so they're already well beyond what the World Bank originally had projected them doing 5 years from now. This 23 gigawatts, just to put that in perspective, New Zealand's entire power grid is 8 gigawatts. So that's 3 New Zealands right there, not in terms of energy, but in terms of capacity, added in wind power in China in 1 year. And then the real interesting milestone is that wind power now produces more electricity in China than nuclear does, as of 3 years ago. So that milestone was already reached. Solar power, I mentioned, that's the largest single energy technology in terms of investment levels. The cost of solar has fallen by a factor of 3 in the last 3 or 4 years. Most people don't know that. The panels themselves are now super cheap, cheaper than anybody could have possibly imagined back in the 1980s, 1990s. We sort of reached the holy grail in a sense of the cost of solar, and that's what's been driving a lot of the change in the last 2 or 3 years. You can see an addition of 30, 40 gigawatts. The market has basically quadrupled since 2010. The total capacity worldwide, I should say, has gone from 40 to 180 gigawatts of solar, so about 40 gigawatts added last year. Again, New Zealand's entire power grid is 8 gigawatts. And if you look at where that's going in, the leaders are Germany, China, Japan, and the US in terms of who's adding what. This was what was added last year. Germany is still number 1 by virtue of a lot of policies, the feed-in tariff that they've had for many years. But China is catching up rapidly, and by the end of this year, China will have added enough to surpass Germany, probably already has now, or later this year. So that's really an amazing story. And I have to say, and I'll get to this in comments a little bit later, New Zealand is woefully behind the curve in terms of solar. Somehow the notion exists here that solar is just too expensive and isn't suited at all for New Zealand. I think that's a real myth that needs to be dispelled, given what's happening around the world and the ways in which solar can be integrated at the local city level. And I'll get to some of the examples. Solar hot water. We've seen huge growth in solar hot water around the world, essentially going from 100 gigawatts up to 400 gigawatts in the last 10 years. You can't really put that number in perspective very well, but 2/3 or 3/4 of that number is in China. So China has been installing these solar hot water heaters with no subsidies, no policy. They're cheap enough. The market is booming, and we can talk about I think we're above 100 million roofs now with solar hot water globally. If you look at where these numbers are going. Biomass for local use, for houses, for buildings, for local combined heat and power, for boilers and so on. The use of biomass both as a global commodity that's traded has been growing, and here's the global trade in biomass over the last years in terms of production. And it's really being used at the local level, and I'll come back to that too. Biofuels, ethanol, biodiesel, we've seen similar growth increases. A lot of the ethanol is being produced in the US and Brazil from corn and from sugar, biodiesel from vegetable oils, waste oils, and so on. There was a bit of a respite in ethanol production. This was basically the US after the global financial crisis, 2008. A lot of bio producers went bankrupt, actually, so it leveled out. But Brazil has actually been taking up the slack. After I produced the global status report for all those years, I decided I wanted to look at the future of renewable energy in parallel with, as a sister report to this status. So I started working on this, and it took me 2 years to really get together a full picture, looking at all the published scenarios, all the work about the future. I interviewed 150 people around the world, experts, even parliamentarians, about their views of the future, industry leaders, finance people. And you can read this report too. It's online, it's free on the REN21 website, on my own website. Just a few highlights from it, showing a view of the future. How much renewables do we expect to see? If you look at sort of historical projections, they're by oil companies, by conservative international organizations, they tend to be where we are today, 15 to 20% total energy from renewables globally in the far future. But an increasing number of projections and scenarios and country targets, policy targets by a variety of countries are showing the shares of renewables going up to 50% or even 60 or 70% by 2050. And these scenarios are becoming much more credible. The basic point is that the low renewable scenarios are simply no longer credible. New Zealand certainly has a leg up. I guess New Zealand is, 45% in terms of total energy renewables. But if you look at the shares in terms of electricity, heat, and transport that are implied by various scenarios, you find relatively high shares of electricity. People say, okay, we can achieve high shares of electricity from renewables in the long term, and many scenarios are showing up to 60, 70, 80%, including those by the US government agencies now. New Zealand, of course, is already at 75% share of electricity, but there is still that 25% to increase. But the main issues really are in terms of how much heat we can get from renewables and how we can use renewables in transport, both through electric vehicles and through biofuels. So you see much, much smaller numbers in scenarios for heat and transport because people have a harder time imagining how we're going to reach those numbers, and the situation here in New Zealand is the same. I'm going to leave that. If you want to ask questions, I can come back to this. But just to point out a few things about investment in the future, the investment in renewable energy in the future. Again, the details are in the report. Many new sources of finance coming into play in terms of investing in renewables. The $250 billion that was invested last year, a lot of that comes from bank lending, a lot of that comes from corporate balance sheets, but more and more we're seeing pension and insurance funds come in, other kinds of aggregated security funds like mortgage-backed securities, sovereign wealth funds, etc. That's an ongoing trend. And city governments as well are providing some of these new sources of finance. I think you're aware perhaps of so-called PACE bonds. I think one city here in New Zealand is doing that. I forget which one it was. But city governments actually borrowing money through municipal bond issues and then lending that to individual households for investments in energy efficiency and renewable energy at the household level, tied in with a property tax assessment for repayment. All kinds of future business models also coming into play. The innovations for the future of renewable energy, the innovations that are going to carry all of this forward are not technical. They're not, we have all the technologies we need. The real innovations are coming from business innovation. And this is something that New Zealand can do. This is something that cities in New Zealand can do a lot more. And when I give examples of cities around the world, you might have some ideas also. These are just some of the basic bullets from that part of the report. And then finally, many companies have a role to play in this future, not just wind turbine manufacturers or solar panel manufacturers, but a whole variety of different kinds of companies, installers at the local level, energy service companies, the solar city business model, leasing solar panels to households and so on. And a lot of these business models are being piloted through or in partnership with city governments. Integrating renewable energy into housing and into transport and into electric power grids. A lot is being done to sort of have a sort of vision of an integrated house with, with heating and electricity provided by renewables, solar, heat storage, biomass, geothermal, sort of integrating all of this together through a very efficient building, very, very high efficiency building, or even a zero energy building, passive, so-called passive house. And if you look, I'm gonna actually skip this one. If you look around the world, you see many of those passive houses now coming into play and being promoted through government policy, actually. I'll show that in a minute. Transport integration, as I said, is mostly about biofuels and electric vehicles, in terms of electricity from renewable energy plus biofuels from renewable energy. And the growing share of two-wheelers. All the two-wheelers in China now are electric, basically. If you go on the streets of Beijing, you don't see any internal combustion two-wheelers anymore. They're all electric. And all the freight is being delivered by two- and three-wheel small freight vehicles. The equivalent to FedEx, to DHL, to the Postal Service. All the freight deliveries now are these small two- and three-wheel electric vehicles. And that's a big trend in developing countries. The developed countries are still aiming for the big, long-range, equivalent to main-size car, types of approaches. These are getting really cheap. Biodiesel, ethanol for public transit, for buses and so on. That's a growing trend. And the whole demand side, flexible demand, flexible customer response to changing grid conditions, the smart grid idea. You vary your demand according to current energy prices, and you can buy and sell and arbitrage and so on, and you can vary your demand in response to what the system is offering you. And that's become a big part of sort of the whole end use or demand side picture, which cities are getting into. Cities are actually aggregating a whole sort of clusters of customers together to provide an aggregate response to vary their demand up and down in response to pricing and system needs. Now I come to the city level, and now I really come to what cities are doing around the world. And there are all kinds of approaches that cities are taking, and they have been taking: investment in public infrastructure, investment in community-based energy projects. Municipalizing or municipal-owned utilities are able to enact new policies at the local level, even feed-in tariffs at the local level that are normally done at the national or state level. Low-energy buildings or zero-energy buildings, zoning, planning, codes and standards when the jurisdiction allows. Many of these things can be done, but it depends on what jurisdiction a particular city has. It depends on the country, whether cities can actually do these things or not. Renewable and district heating and cooling is a very big one. In terms of developing district heating systems, the city of Copenhagen is planning to supply all heat in Copenhagen from biomass, from renewable energy. I think that's by 2020, 2025, basically through these district energy systems, all fueled through biomass. Public transit fuels, I've mentioned, biodiesel, ethanol for public transit vehicles, for taxi fleets and so on. And electric vehicle infrastructure, charging points for electric vehicles, growing in many, many cities around the world. So this is sort of the basic list of things. You can't quite read this, but this is a list of targets for share of renewable energy. So there are many examples, and this is just a selected list of examples showing which cities have targets for total amount of energy from renewable energy, total amount of electricity from renewable energy, even up to 100%, and also total consumption of electricity for city-owned purchases. So lots and lots of cities now have targets for shares of renewable energy. This is showing you the targets or the policies enacted for building energy efficiency, zero energy buildings, carbon neutral buildings, low energy buildings, all kinds of all kinds of really interesting examples here. This is just a few of them. All new buildings in Germany should use zero amount of primary energy by 2020. They're going to be offsets and so on. In the UK, all new houses must be carbon neutral in terms of the carbon performance, and then we can talk about what that means. But it basically means that the housing sector is tending towards zeroing itself out as far as the central energy system or the grid sees residential, the housing sector. The houses are supplying more of their own energy, and they're offsetting energy and selling energy into the grid and so on. So here's just a whole list of examples of what cities are doing, and this comes from a whole series of different sources. But I thought I would just highlight some of these. Copenhagen aims to be the world's first carbon neutral capital city by 2025. 192 German cities have remunicipalized their local electricity networks and moving towards municipal ownership so that the local government, the city, can control what the electricity grid does, and distributed generation and buying and selling locally and so on. Los Angeles, Palo Alto, Long Island are examples of cities that have local feed-in tariffs, a fixed price for selling your power into the grid. Mecca in Saudi Arabia tendered a 100 megawatt renewable power plant. The PACE, the Property Assessed Clean Energy Program, I mentioned that was existing in 142 cities, I think before many cities started going bankrupt in the US, and a lot of them are not able to do that anymore, issue bonds for that. Lancaster, California mandates solar systems on all new single-family homes. Johannesburg, South Africa program for solar hot water for 110 low-income households. Kyoto, 3 kilowatts of solar power are mandatory for all new large buildings. Munich aims to be 100% renewable electricity by 2025. I think it's missing a year there. They basically are going to supply all the electricity by all consumers in the city, 100% renewables, either through local sources, or they're investing in wind farms throughout Europe, or they're buying green power from other sources. But it's basically an offsetting process so that accounting-wise, they consume, the amount of electricity consumed in Munich is basically all coming from renewables. Amsterdam has a goal of 100% renewable energy powered electric transport by 2040. They're providing subsidies for new electric taxis. Barcelona has the world's first wind-powered electric vehicle charging station, and lots of other examples I could give. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but it gives you some flavor, some idea of the kinds of things that we're seeing in cities around the world. And then if I looked at the most recent trends in terms of the current global status report and the kinds of things that we've seen in really just the last year, these are sort of additions to the overall picture just from the past year, really. Target setting, targets, as I said, for shares of renewable energy. Austin, Texas, 65% renewable energy by 2025. New York City, 350 megawatts of solar PV added in the next 10 years. Vienna, half of all its heat demand should be covered through solar thermal energy by 2050. Second, the global movement towards 100% renewable energy. Lots and lots of small communities, modest-sized cities. 140 municipalities in Germany have committed to 100% renewable energy in the long term. That's a growing movement there. Fukushima prefecture, the source of the nuclear accident, 100% renewables for the entire prefecture, state level, by 2040. Maui, Hawaii, the first American island to be powered 100% by renewables. That's their goal. And many cities and municipalities are already 100%. You can find, they're smaller ones, 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 population maybe. There are already 74 such municipalities, communities in Germany that have reached 100% goals, and many of them are even exporting their renewables, and that's creating an income for the local economy. The number 3, mandates for buildings. Sao Paulo and other Brazilian cities taking a leading role in adopting building codes to promote renewable heating technologies. 10 cities in Shandong province in China with mandates for solar hot water heaters. Dubai and Gurgaon in India mandate the use of solar PV. Number 4, net metering for solar power. Net metering is where basically you can buy and sell your solar power into the grid, at the same price that you buy it from. So it allows you to get a retail price, a buyback rate essentially, for your solar power that's equivalent to the retail price you can buy and sell. And cities are enabling this process, not just state governments or national governments around the world. New Zealand has generally a very low buyback rate from the retailers, the utilities. New net metering programs in India, Dubai in the Middle East. Next one, public financing policies. Barcelona is providing $14 million subsidy to promote rooftop renovations, including solar water heaters. Melbourne, rebates to businesses for the purchase and installation of solar PV systems. Shenzhen in China, increasing electric vehicles used in the city's taxi fleet. Then public-private partnerships. Partnerships to develop geothermal resources in Baoding City in China. Melbourne has a group purchasing model where large energy users across the city can aggregate their demand to benefit from economies of scale in purchasing. And then finally, electric vehicles and public buses. In terms of San Francisco transforming its fleet into biofuels and electricity, Paris investing in a fleet of electric city buses, and so on. So this is a very extensive list. It starts to get overwhelming very quickly, but this is really just what's happened in the last year. All this didn't exist a year ago, and we could even add more just to this list for the last year. And so when I say the hundreds or thousands of cities, these are the kinds of things that I'm talking about that are really coming into force. And you say, okay, well, which of these can New Zealand cities begin to emulate, to learn from, to perhaps to innovate in terms of local economy, in terms of jobs, in terms of reducing emissions of carbon in the transport sector, in terms of warmer homes and less and higher levels of comfort in buildings and so on. So I basically want to leave it at that. I've provided 3 additional slides which sort of I've used in past lectures in terms of the kinds of things that I see for New Zealand specifically that can be done. And these actually these 3 slides here, transport and electricity and heating, came from a talk I gave last year to the Auckland City Council as part of their low carbon plan that they've been developing for the future. And converting the public transport fleet to use alternative fuels, passenger vehicle fleet becoming majority electric, and I really think that that's going to be one of the most important things here, is riding the global trend in terms of electric vehicles and that electricity all coming from renewables. Electric vehicle charging network, cycling infrastructure, etc. If you want to talk, I'll put this back up when we get to questions in terms of transport. Then in terms of local power generation, rooftop solar, demand response I've mentioned before in terms of flexibility of demand that can provide benefits to the local grid, to the national grid, and how to compensate that, how to pay for that so that the people doing it get some benefit from it, and that can be done at the local level. And in fact, this business of demand response, Vector in Auckland is leasing, installing solar power systems with batteries to individual houses and customers. And one of the reasons they're doing that is because they can use those batteries then to reduce their total peak demand that they have to pay as a demand charge to TransPower. And if they can reduce that total peak demand through use of all those batteries, which they have installed and have some control over, then that would actually reduce their total costs. Even though the batteries are still a bit too expensive, they're not really commercial yet. I could talk about, they're installing batteries with solar in Germany, in Hawaii, in Italy, to reduce total peak demand as well. Smart grids, peer-to-peer energy systems. Actually, London is developing the idea of you can sell power to your neighbor. There's a local market, for all the profession here about free markets and so on in New Zealand. There is no market where I can sell power to my neighbors at the local or city level. That should be a free market. I should be able to sell power and compete with the retail price. Maybe pay a small wire fee to the lines company to use their line just to get to my neighbor and so on. That peer-to-peer energy is actually being promoted by a number of cities and jurisdictions around the world now, including London. And then finally, heat supply, building scale heating, community scale heating, heat supply from municipal waste, and so on. Lots of things in terms of zero energy buildings, solar hot water for heating on a community scale. The solar thermal panels, solar hot water, have tended to be on a household scale for individual buildings, individual households in the past. But now more and more we're seeing large-scale solar heating systems that might apply to a district, a cluster of buildings, or it might apply to a university or a school, or be combined with biomass heating or a combined heat and power plant, and all integrated into a larger heating network. So those kinds of things can be thought about also here at the local level for what cities are doing. I think solar hot water has a very poor reputation here in New Zealand. The quality and the cost and so on from past decades even, but it's really cheap in China, and it could be a lot cheaper here if you could figure out ways to have economies of scale, to have lower labor categories, so you don't have to pay a plumber $100 an hour to install it. If you could really standardize it and make it low cost and high quality. So with that, I'll turn it over for questions. I've covered an awful lot of material, I know, in a very short time, but I wanted to sort of give you the big picture and then allow you to think about some of these things. And again, you can have a copy of the slides, you can download the papers, and get more details. So let's just open it up. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Eric. That's a fantastic overview for everybody. And it raises a lot of questions, of course. So I'm just going to kick off, while you're working out your questions, I'm just going to kick off with one from my point of view, which is, can New Zealand get to 100% renewable energy? I'm not talking about 100% renewable electricity, because that's a no-brainer. What about 100% renewable energy? All the fuel, the heat, so on. And if so, by when? I know you've been coming here for a few years now, so you've had a bit of prep to do, prep time. So this is my exam question for Eric. So feel free.
Well, on the electricity side, the most common response I get is, well, we already have 75%, so let's, we don't have to go any higher, or there's already enough wind power consented to reach 100% if we really need it, and there's a power glut anyway now with demand being lower than originally projected and so on. So, okay, you can say that, but I think in the end, electricity is New Zealand's really strong card, and when you start talking about electricity for transport, you're going to see an increase in the long run in terms of demand. So I really think that electric vehicles are going to be the major way in which New Zealand is going to convert to renewable transport, not biofuels. Advanced biofuels from cellulose, from crop waste and so on is possible. It's still not quite commercial yet. You could see production of advanced biofuels here in New Zealand for transport from crop waste and agricultural waste and so on. But I think that's only going to go so far. And I think you'll find that electricity and increased electricity from renewables to power transport, but you have to connect it all together, and you have to be smart about it. When are you charging the vehicles to make use of the renewable energy? You have to have smart charging in terms of time of day and pricing and all of this. And also the vehicles themselves, thinking more about two-wheelers, about three-wheelers, thinking more about small cars with low range. Can you get by with 50-kilometer range if you charge it up every night or charge it up while you're at work during the day in the parking garage? Yes, I think so. If the company selling you the electric vehicle, say, offered you a full range, 300-kilometer range gasoline car for 3 or 4 days a month for free, and then you could maybe use more. So you actually have access to the kinds of car you need when you need it, but still you can get by with a low-range electric, and that's going to be a lot cheaper in the long run. So it's thinking of innovative transport models like that, business models, mobility service models, car sharing, these kinds of things. It's way out of the box for sort of conventional thinking, but I think that's where things are going. For heating, it's really tough. For heating, I think there is a big potential for solar, certainly for biomass, geothermal in selected places. I think a lot of the heating can end up being electric as well. We're seeing much more of the heat pumps being installed over the last decade, I think, here compared to electric resistance heating. And to me, that's a very positive trend. It's much more efficient to use the heat pumps. Eventually, those heat pumps can be powered off the grid, and I think a lot of the heating is going to be electric, heat pumps from renewables. So I guess that's my answer, is that it all becomes electric in the long run, including heating and including transport, as a sort of simplified.
What about process heat for people like Fonterra?
Yeah.
That's a bit of a hard no.
There's really very little use of renewables yet for industrial process heat. There's a great potential for low temperature, even medium temperature heat. In countries with great solar resources or desert-like conditions, you have solar thermal power that can generate a lot of heat at high temperatures, so-called CSP plants, concentrating solar thermal plants. They're not quite suited for New Zealand. You find them in the U.S. Southwest and in Spain and the Middle East now. Yeah, high temperature, process heat, but how much of that is really, how much of that, in terms of industry in New Zealand, if we're looking at just low temperature and medium temperature heat, and
yeah, we've got a bit in the South Island with Fonterra,
Yeah.
with like coal burning that goes on. So
Yeah.
it's a pretty top of mind
I mean,
issue.
I think that that low and medium temperature solar heating is quite well suited for agricultural processing, for the kinds of crop processing. I'm not sure about milk, but the kinds of crop processing that would take place here.
Okay, that's a good note to end on. So thanks very much, Eric.